of all, was responsible 59% of all green Arabica exports. I mean, this is a fantastic performance, and you have to give full respect to the farmers, workers, exporters, and dock workers in Brazil. And also, you know, they were definitely helped by the real, and also by in a way, by the failure, as I said, the poor performance of other countries. And there's obviously that not all the exchange rate policies in other countries were favorable, as in Brazil, but also there's huge structural problems in places like Central America. So, you know, Brazil has clearly outcompeted any other origin. Even in the Robusta side, we've seen the increase. So in the year to January 21, Conilons are taking a 10% share of green Robusta exports, partly due to the problems in Vietnam with shipping out in the freight problems in Vietnam. But also in Brazil, we've seen a recovery from the poor crops in Conilon crops due to the dry weather we've seen over the last 2 or 3 years. We're seeing the return of some plantings, new plantings, after crop trees were taken out because of the damage caused by dry weather, earlier dry weather. And we're also seeing replacement with new varieties. So the Conilon sector in Brazil is very dynamic. Also, we mustn't forget that Brazil, the Conilon market is not just the external market. A huge amount of the Brazil Conilon crop is going into the internal market. We could say for sure 50% of a plus 20 million bag market. So very dynamic Conilon sector in Brazil. Have had a few problems with the glyphosate issue, and we know about the problems of sometimes using Conilons in Europe because also glyphosate problems, though I'm not sure why Conilon should be picked out particularly, but also the difference in cut between Conilons and Vietnam. So, but what we're seeing, I think, is yes, a lot of the Conilons are going into the certified stocks, but I think in some other regions outside Europe, Conilons is now being seen as one of the best options for Robustas because it's cheap, it's reliable, it doesn't have the freight issues of Vietnam. So we're seeing it capturing a bigger share of, if you like, the more peripheral markets. I didn't have full year figures for the EU market. That's just come in a few days ago, so I didn't have time to go through them, but I wanted to show what this meant for one particular market. So I picked the USA, where the figures have been available for a month or so. What I've done with these are not just customs figures. I've actually adjusted the customs figures in order to reflect the real share of Robustas and Arabicas in the USA. In other words, for instance, with Indonesia, I don't count all Indonesian exports as Robustas, as the ICO does in its statistics, because we know that some of the Indonesian exports to the USA are Arabicas. The same applies with Vietnam and a number of other origins. I've done this by looking at the export figures and using that to divide up the import share in the USA. But what we can see, one of the things you see about if you like, the blend, the national blend in particular countries, is it's quite stable. But in this case, we can see the increasing Brazil usage of Brazil within the USA market. I should add as well that I do allow for certified changes in the US stocks as additions and subtractions from consumption as well. So really the numbers should reflect as much as possible what's being consumed in the USA. So that we say that what we're seeing is that increase in Brazil, and also there's two factors in the Robusta market. We're seeing, interestingly, a decreasing share of the Robustas in the USA consumption. People have picked me up about these figures, so I checked them, and they're, as far as I can see, they're completely correct. But we're also seeing Brazil taking a bigger percentage share of that market. So there's an interesting question here that we can't go into about why there's the declining share, Robusta share in the US market, maybe because of the pod cell. But I think for the purposes of this presentation, we can see the increasing importance of Brazil within the USA market and the declining importance of the mild market as well. So the final, I think the final thing that really underlines the dominance of Brazil at the moment, and in a way, it was a historic moment in March when Brazil semi-washed in the certified stocks actually overtook the amount of Honduran coffee in the certified stock. So we've seen almost a baton changing hands, how the market has moved from what was essentially a Central American contract to what is now, if you like, a contract which is much more based on semi-washed coffee. I just checked yesterday, and there were 860,000 bags of semi-washed within the certified stock. So I mean, this is a fantastic achievement from Brazil. Given the grading failures, you must guess that something like 1 million bags, just close to 1 million bags of semi-washed has been shipped towards the New York market. I think that this does change, and that has, for the moment, is changed the nature of the New York market. And this is a new thing, so I think everyone is learning about the implications of this. One of the implications we've seen is obviously the high differentials in Central America, which it's put pressure on the New York market, and we're seeing this in the impact. We're seeing continuously high differentials for mild coffees, because I guess to an extent it's not reflecting the Central American crop so much in the price. As said, what surprised people is the pass rates, which have been much better for semi-washed than anyone thought possible. I think going forward, there's a question of the usage of semi-washed. Will people use older semi-washed coffee? It does have a reputation of the quality fading more quickly than for centrals. A lot of open questions there. I would say that in a normal year, that having, if you like, the strategy of firms delivering coffee into the certified stocks has worked so well, and that it would have been a continuous improvement, and this would have been a feature of the market for some time to come. Obviously, that's if things were normal. I think one of the features of this presentation is to point out that things are not normal in going forward. 2020, the climate was not normal. 21-22 will not be a normal Brazil supply year. So the fate of the semi-washed in the certified stocks is open to question. These are my warehouse stock estimates based on talking with warehouse companies and various other places. There is a big problem with the stock figures, as we know at the moment, because Antwerp isn't releasing reliable stock figures. So in Antwerp, I've just actually used the change in the certified stocks as the basis for changing Antwerp stocks. But what I want to say, and what comes across, is that really the increase in the Brazil stocks, which is the green bar, naturals, and I count semi-wash within the natural, has not been as big as you might have thought. So do remember, a lot of the gradings for semi-washed occurred after the end of December, which is the cut-off point for this diagram. So we would actually see a bigger increase if we'd possible to extend it through into February. But I think the point, you argue about the figures and the exact figures, but I think the point stands. And that is, aside from the certified stocks, Brazil coffee, Arabica coffee that is being exported, is being roasted and not stored. And that's important implications, because there's no big stocks or stocks hidden away that can make, in consumer markets, that can make up for shortfalls in Brazil supply. So that's a kind of very short introduction to where we are. I think it's underlined the dominance of Brazil. Now, I was asked when I was asked to do this presentation, specific request was to give a guide to the crop forecasting in Brazil. I think sometimes the Brazil crop numbers are presented like a magician pulls a rabbit out of the hat. And, you know, my ambition over the next set of slides is to, if you like, pull away the curtain behind the magic of crop forecasting and kind of show the machinery behind how it occurs. So what I'm doing is I'm going to, for the next few moments, present a bluffer's guide to Brazil crop forecasting. But don't try this at home, please, because it could be dangerous. So the first part of a bluffer's guide is know the crop rhythm. And that's really important, the crop rhythm in Brazil. And I'll give a good example of this, is why it's important. Is the drought in 2014, which we saw, had the impact of the climate change then was very different from what we're going to see in this year. In 2014, the results of the dry weather in January and February were smaller screen sizes, increased defects in the coffee. And this was because it took place at the very January and February, where there's a different development phase in the Brazil crop. And this year we've had dry weather during the flowering phase. Again, that has different implications. So looking at this diagram, and I think the first thing to remember, I apologize for the older hands here who are watching to something so basic, but it's important to know, one is how long it takes from the start of the development of the crop to the actual harvest. So the first time to look at is that has implications for the 21-22 crop is September 2019, where we start to have the on growth for the next crop. And it's important to know that in Arabica coffee, the crop is never harvested or never grown on the same set of branches. You see this in the branch, the diagram at the top. What we have is a crop on one bit of the branch, which has just been harvested, but the next crop will come from the on growth of that branch. So it's very important to understand that. It also explains to an extent why you have a biennial cycle in Arabicas, because if you have a very large crop, the energy of the plant goes into holding that crop, and that gives less energy to put onto the on growth for the next crop. And that on growth sets a capacity limit to how big the next crop can be. So it's very important about the on growth and where the next harvest will come from that on growth. So to go through the diagram, as we said, as we go from September 2019 to December 2009, we have the development of branches and the flowering nodes, because where the leaves are, you will have nodes where you can have flowers and where the cherries will develop. And also you start to see the initiation of the buds, which will eventually produce the flowers. So we go through into March 2020, we have the continued development. And then into May, we come to an important time of the year when we go into the dry season in Brazil. And at that point, the flower buds and the grain branches go into a dormancy. So actually dry weather at that point in time is not really that much of a problem, because the tree doesn't have huge requirements for moisture. The buds are dormant, so the tree doesn't have to, the tree can get by. In fact, it's good to have a prolonged period of dry weather while the tree is dormant. It helps for synchronizing flowerings. In terms of research, that point in time is quite interesting, because really you don't have much branch growth from May. So by May, you do have an idea of the actual capacity in terms of the flowering nodes that are available to produce the next crop. Then we go on through the dry season, and in September, another key point in the development of the crop, you have the return of the rains, And the return, these rains are what will break the dormancy of the plant and will start the flowering. That's obviously, there's a picture of flowering. So it's a beautiful sight, actually, if you're there. And this is the key point in the whole story of the crop 21-22 crop development. At that point, it's a question of the flowerings, the fixing of the flowerings. What you see is the flowerings then start to fix. They become what are called pinhead cherries. And there's a picture of them after 4 weeks. But at that point, the demand of the plant for water increases exponentially. That is very important that you have backup showers, because at that stage of the crop development, the cherries can fall. As we go through into October and December, we have the flowering period. We would have had 2 or 3 flowerings, is quite common across the Arabica coffee areas, but you also have the flowerings develop into chimbinos. And the important thing as well, which are the more developed coffee cherries. The important thing to know there is that after around 11 weeks, most of those chimbinos will develop through to maturity unless there's some extreme climatic event. So that's the flowering stage from October to December. And then we come to January to March, we enter what's called the cherry fill stage, where the bean inside the cherry actually starts to fill out and kind of impacts the screen sizes eventually at the harvest. But I think what is important here is that from January to March, you have no more flowerings, or you will not have any more cherries on the tree. So, and also the chimbinos that are there, the cherries that are there will go, the vast bulk will go through to the majority. So at that stage, you can do the macro surveys. And, you know, for us, that's important. That's why it's important to go around in January. But rainfall at that time is more about screen sizes than adding cherries to the tree. And then we go back, go to January, March, we're still in that stage of the granulation where the cherries become harder. And finally, January to July, you know, around about, we reach full maturity. So very important to know the rhythm of the coffee crop in Brazil. Now, I'll make a break here to say that is, you know, in an optimal world, that's the development of the crop. But knowing this, it makes what happened in the current year incredibly important, because we had dry weather during the key flowering period. During the flower, and this is a diagram of the rainfall in Guaxupé in the current year, which is in green. Oh, sorry, in 2020, current in 2020, and then the blue is the normal rainfall, and then what I added in the rainfall in 1985, where there was a huge dry weather period, which actually cut the crop in 1986 by 58% to 13.5 million bags. So what we see here is that the dry period from May onwards was extremely dry. Now, as I've said, that isn't necessarily hugely important if the rains return, but it does mean that the plantations enter the flowering season with a very low soil moisture reserve. So yeah, it's not great, but if the rains return, then that can be overcome. But what we found is that in September and October in 2020, the rainfall wasn't good. It was well below the normal. Therefore, trees that were stressed because they'd carried a record crop through to maturity, were defoliated after a harvest, were suddenly faced with a situation where there was little rainfall. So there were rains to break the dormancy, but what you didn't get was the backup showers. So also, if we look at the black line, which shows the average temperatures in Brazil, in Guaxupé at that time, there was an extreme wave of heat in October and November. In fact, at that time, there were record temperatures were recorded in Sao Paulo and Minas. So the heat in itself can damage the physiology of the tree. Extreme heat can damage the physiology of the Arabica tree. What it can also do is damage the flowers. It produces what called star flowers, which will not form into cherries, which will become branches. So I think the diagram in itself tells you that there's been problems, but I wanted to focus on another aspect as well, because it's not just the amount of rainfall that's important, but also the pattern of the rainfall. And I think the pattern of the rainfall in 2020 was particularly bad, because we had what we had is showers. You need about 10 to 15 millimeters to break dormancy and induce some form of a flowering. We had showers that broke the dormancy of the plant, but what we didn't have then was the backup showers to support the soil moisture reserves. So we can see there was a flowering in August, in some areas, in some areas. And then we had another flowering in September, but there were big gaps between the arrival of the flowerings, the development of the pinhead stage, and the arrival of the backup showers. And the lack of soil moisture, the heat, and the failure of the backup showers was another reason we had abortions of flowerings and the loss of pinhead cherries, which as we will see, led to a big reduction in the Brazil Arabica crop, in our opinion. The weather has since normalized during the period of the cherry fill, but we still don't think it's completely ideal. Also, as I said, as I want to underline, once the flowering potential has been used, rainfall in December and January isn't going to give you more cherries on the tree. It will affect the screen size, but you won't get more cherries. And the cherries on the tree are the key component of what gives you determining yields. Yes, the screen size, it can make a difference, but it is the amount of cherries on the tree that is absolutely key. And as I said, that failed during the flowerings. But there's a couple of other factors, is that the rainfall in this period from December through to March and May is also important for the on growth for the 22-23 season. There was a late start to the on growth because of the dry weather we saw in October and November, but now we're also seeing a less than ideal pattern in the rainfall for the development of the 22-23 crop. Now, you don't want this is really not something that can be determined by theory, how the 22-23 crop is developing. You have to judge this by field work, and that's why I feel that the Bison Luxury report, which we will release in May after the field trip, was very important to give some ideas of the tendency and capacity of the 22-23 crop. And we'll deal with that later. But I have to say, one thing that I'm hearing a buzz about at the moment is that the crop forecasts through to the end of March are for very dry in the Sul de Minas, because of a block in high pressure area. So I think we're going to hear more talk as we go forward about shortfalls of rainfall in March and the impact on the screen sizes for 21-22 and the branch growth for 22-23. As I said, we hold judgment on this one because it is possible it has caused problems, but it's field work that will determine if this is true. Second part of our Bluffers Guide, know where to look for the coffee. It sounds very easy, but I think one thing we found about Brazil, and the knowledge I've acquired, is that Brazil is a really big place. So it's important to know where the coffee is concentrated. It's concentrated in specific areas and specific municipalities. So you have to know where that is in order to, one, get a good sample of that coffee, and also optimize the time you spend traveling between the municipalities. Basically, you base the statistic on the coffee area, are based on numbers you get from Canabi and the IBGE in Brazil. These numbers are good, but we do think there's some problems with them, particularly in the Conilon areas. But yeah, the numbers are in many ways better than the kind of crop forecast they produce. But I also like to emphasize doing a normal crop tour actually gives you very information about the development of the crop area, because you're able to see where new plantings are and where areas are being abandoned. But I think what I want to emphasize is that knowing where the crop is enables you to get a good sample, and a good sample which you go around regularly. The importance of it is it keeps you honest. It means literally that you can't cherry pick, and that's almost a literal phrase. You can't cherry pick the farms you go to, because I think it's so easy to if you want a bad crop to go to bad farms. And I think this is done subconsciously. I'm not suggesting people are naturally dishonest, but you can it can affect where you go and what you see. Whereas if you have a regular sample that you go to reflecting the whole of the coffee area, it keeps you honest, and it makes it kind of challenges your subconscious bias, because you have to go to the farms you go to. I have to say the key after that is to sample and then sample some more. The sampling is absolutely exhausting. It's and detailed work, but it's very vital. And I mean, we have full respect here for our field researcher, Gilmar de Lobo, who traveled close to 13,000 kilometers on his field trip and went to 3,136 sample sites. We have an example of him kind of when his beard has been both pruned and unpruned here, so just for balance. But I rather than him, I'd like to also, for people new to Brazil, is to show the variation in crop types if you look at the trees behind it. In the lower picture, we have a very, very nice field, fully leaved, loads of cherries in the crop. But at the top, and this is much more typical this year, we can see the lack of cherries, the lack of full rosettas on the branch, and the generally poor state of the crop. So there's huge variations in the crop, and also this is what the sample picks up. Now, the part 4 of the Bluffer's Guide is to find yourself a consistent methodology, and there's certain problems you have to deal with. One is that there's huge amounts of cherries on a tree, around 5,500 on a typical Arabica plant, even more on a typical Robusta plant. So, and there's huge variation, as we've seen from the photos. So that gives you a problem. It's not like cocoa, where you can count every cocoa bean on a tree. That gives you a problem. So the other thing is you've got to get close. You've got to get inside the farm to see where the cherries are, and also to pick out what is typical of that farm. You will find that just going around the edge of plantations is always a poor guide to what's in the middle of that plantation, because the trees on the outside receive more nutrients and that. So get inside the plantation, get inside the plant to see the cherries. Then we have the problem is that you can only see the cherries. And what the size of the beans inside, as I've mentioned, can affect the output, does affect the output. So that's something you have to look at in the harvest, but you can get an idea earlier. But there are advantages. One, you get good access to the farms. In Brazil, it's very possible to go in and out without a problem. The openness of the Brazil and hospitality of the Brazil farmer is fantastic. So you're learning from them all the time. And the other thing is, what I mentioned before, is that when a cherry is fixed on the tree, it is very rarely lost. So you don't have such a big problem of losing cherries to trees, though you do need to refine the crop estimate later in the year. Right, now, here's the where you can go and do your own crop forecasting in the garden or something. But I do give you a warning, not just is it dangerous, but it's not easy. And really, there are no shortcuts in doing it. Yes. Let me see here. Yeah, there's no shortcuts in doing it. And this is just very rapidly. It's very difficult to go through this too technical. It's something that you learn more by doing than by theoretical. But this is what our process was. It's actually to go into the field, and we've seen these over 3,000 sample sites, select 10 trees as randomly as possible, but it should reflect the overall condition of the sample site. So don't go to the edge of the farm and do the trees there. Get in and make something that reflects the sample site. Then by eye, you judge the number of litres of cherries on each of the chosen sample trees. It's done by litres because it's a cultural thing in Brazil. I think pickers used to be paid by the litre of cherries, and probably still are in some cases. So, you know, farmers and crop researchers in Brazil are very used to looking at the amount of litres of cherries on a tree. There's about 600 to 800 cherries in a litre of Arabica coffee. This can vary depending on the size of the cherry, but yeah, that's the kind of size. Then from you can convert the numbers of litres of cherries into bags of green coffee, uses a standard conversion ratio. And this is what we found over the years is the usual conversion from litres of cherries into bags of green coffee. So for instance, in a normal year, it takes about 480 litres of Arabica coffee to produce one bag of green coffee, and it's about 320 litres for Robustas. So we've got a standard conversion factors. We have an account based on our observation of the trees, and then using that best estimate, we can actually get a yield for the amount of green coffee per hectare based on the number of trees a hectare. And we find in Brazil that, you know, it's around the standard size, around 3,500 trees a hectare, though you see tree densities of anywhere like 10,000, 12,000 trees a hectare I've seen. Obviously, in the older plantations, you can even go down to 1,000, 2,000 trees a hectare. But you need that, you can measure that up. So using your judgment of the green coffee that can be done from your sample, using the number of trees per hectare, you're able to count the overall green coffee yield on that site. You will actually adjust your standard calculation after the harvest because you can take samples to judge what yield is actually coming in that particular year. But using this thing, you're able to get quite a good estimate of the yield per hectare, and then you've got 3,000 and more samples to build up the yield in the municipality, the yield in the state, and eventually the yield in Brazil. I think to do this, you need experience. I mean, obviously, it's not something a beginner can do. And I have to say, I've worked with some legends in crop forecasting, Beto Ramos, Juliano Motto, and Gilmar, and these people have fantastic knowledge and experience. And, you know, I'm in awe of their ability to judge the amount of cherries on a tree, their drive, their ability, and their dedication to this to this crop forecasting work. To be honest, I think the best crop surveyors are slightly mad, but good crazy in a good way. But let's say, I mean, you must assess the accuracy of the judgment, because you can go around, you can pay the farmer or ask the farmer and actually strip trees after the harvest, and to compare your judgment with the surveyor's estimate of the crop. And I can see the graph below shows a tour we did where we went round blind judging the amount of coffee on a tree, and then compared it. We actually harvested the trees and then compared the outturn with what we had judged before. And you can see for me, it's always astonishing how close these subjective judgments are. I mean, the method does have the disadvantage is subjective, and there are other methods counting cherries on branches, but the problem with that is slow. The advantage of this methodology is you can go to a vast number of sites, do it very, very, very rapidly, and the tour itself produces a huge amount of analytical information on the Brazil crop. So that's how that's some of the mechanics of the crop estimate. So let's go and see. Jean-Marc did this trip in December, January, and I want to show what he found, because I think they're quite interesting results. It's a very strange year, particularly with the variation. It's vital to have a good methodology in this year, and it's vital to have a good sample. And I think we have these things. That's why we're prepared to push these numbers to the public. All right. So what we see, we thought that in the 2021 was a record crop in Brazil. We think over 70 million bags. We have 71 million bags. I think that's a bit above the estimate, but again, we feel that's justified. Fantastic Arabica crop, again, a record Arabica crop, 52.45 million bags, and a good Conilon crop, 18.5 million bags. Our 2-year estimate, our estimate shows a 3 point for the 21-22 crop year, shows a 3.8. Our central estimate shows a 3.8 million bag increase in the Robusta crop, and a 23.8 million bag fall in the Arabica crop. I think our numbers are outside the consensus of the trade, but we're happy for that. We feel the methodology and our sampling method justifies us as having these numbers. What you will see to the right is another estimate. This is actually based on what could happen if there's optimal screen sizes going around at the harvest. So we feel the maximum potential would be 54 million bags. We actually don't think this is a scenario at the moment is very likely, given the problems with the rainfall. But at the moment, and we stick with our central estimate. But again, we will refine this estimate in the May and in July as we go around after the harvest. But I think the other thing is in a way, to look at the 2-year moving average, because the up and down cycle of the crop means that you should look at that as well. And over the 2-year moving average of the 2021 and 21-22 crop, we were seeing if you like, a fall of 3.5 million bags in the total crop, and 4.5 million bags in the Arabica crop as a 2-year moving average. So you could say in a way that seems to say, well, maybe the problem isn't so big. We think this is wrong. One, because the 22-23 crop is going to have to go back to record levels, which we think is probably unlikely, in order to stop the moving average falling further. And also, I think it's a theme I'm going to develop towards the end of this presentation, is that a lot of the record crop has already been used and has been exported or consumed internally. So that is not available to help supply in a 21-22 year. I have to say that, I've gone through saying how hard it is to judge the amount of cherries on the tree and the yields. But actually this year, the farmers made it a lot easier for us, because they've actually simply taken the judgment out of our hands and pruned down the coffee or replanted. The thing is, in Brazil, you have high labor costs. If you have a crop that's slow, economically, it's just not viable to bring that crop through to the harvest. The other problem is that if you once you allow the beans to go through maturity, you have to completely pick all the cherries off the tree, or if the cherries fall to the ground, you have brocker problems. So it's if the harvest looks like it's going to be low, it's a much more economic thing to actually prune down the area. So what we can see with these statistics is that the amount of pruning is, in some cases, is like kind of easily double the level it was in previous years. And on the right, again, for people who are not so used to Brazil, there's a quick picture of a tree that's been pruned down by the escalatamento method, where the branches are vertically pruned or cut. And the important point is that once the plant is pruned, it will produce nothing in the next year. And there's even another method, which is the Recepa method, where it's just cut the stump. So nothing in the next year. The year after, it produces a reasonable crop, but it's, in the third year, the crop is better than it would have been. So, you're sacrificing the crop in the first year for a crop in the 3 years' time, in the third year. But what the farmers done this year, because of the dry weather and because of the impact of the record harvest and the defoliation of the plant, it has simply stepped up the rate of replanting in some cases and pruning. This means a lot of the coffee area will produce no coffee at all this year. But another factor we found is that actually some of the farmers, we feel pruning is very rational. But what we found is that farmers actually delayed the pruning. The best pruning is done immediately after the harvest to maximize the branch growth for the crop, for the next crop and the crop after that. We feel that this year the pruning was done very late because farmers were expecting a later fixing of the crop and that things could improve and would justify keeping the pruning, but not pruning. But in fact, they had to prune. They pruned late, some in November, even December, I believe. And that means that the on growth for the next crop is not as good as it should be because of that late start to the crop branch development. Here are our looking at the individual regions. These are our percentage changes between 21-22 and the previous year. In the Sul-Lamina, 47% down, and this is due, really, a lot is due to the climate, the hot and dry climate. In the Cerrado, there's a lot of irrigation in the plants, and the rains did return earlier, so it's quite a surprise in a way that there's such a big downturn in yields. But we feel this is because the extreme heat at that time actually had a detrimental impact on the flowering. And again, we're into a down cycle. The Zona da Mata, the weather was better, but the Zona da Mata had a record crop in the previous year. Also, they're smaller farmers, probably slightly less experienced in general. So there's much more of a cyclical impact. So that the Zona da Mata is much more about an extreme cycle than in a way about the climate. Sao Paulo is a combination of both an exaggerated cyclical downturn, but also real climate damage. And the only place where we see, an upturn in production is in Espírito Santo with the Robusta, plantations, with the new varieties, which are having fantastic yields coming into production. We do have a bit of a question mark there because in January there's been an outbreak of scale insects and red mite, so that can have an impact on conilon production, but we have to judge that in the next field trip. So these are our conclusions, I think. I think I've gone through most of these, so obviously is their conclusion. But you know, we are great believers that there's been a big fall in the Arabica output, 45% fall, and we've gone through the reasons for this. But I think what I want to emphasize here is the impact of the weather on the branch growth for the 2023 crop. The weather during the beanfield period hasn't been ideal. Also, I think the flowerings were widely separated, and what we observed in the field trip was that the cherries on the trees were in various stages of maturity. In 2020, there was a very synchronized maturation of the cherries, which leads to good quality if you have dry weather during the harvest. And the quality in 2020 has been exceptional. But we feel there's non-homogeneous cherries on the tree, and that would bias us to believe, depending on the weather at the harvest, that we would have a poorer quality crop in 21, 22, not just a smaller crop. We feel that because of non-homogeneous development and the small crop, there will be a lower percentage production of semi-washed. One, you do need the best semi-washed is produced by a homogeneous processing of the cherries. Obviously, you do, there are machines to pick out, colour sort the cherries, but it is better if they're coming in homogeneously. The other point is that a lot of the semi-wash is actually not done to produce a premium product. It's done to save drying space on the terrace. Now, if the crop is smaller, obviously there's not so much demand on the drying space, so there's less incentive for the larger farmers to produce semi-washed coffee. So that's it. These are our surveys. Big fall in Arabicas, big increase in Robustas. So just a quick, finally, in the final few slides, what does this mean? What does the production cut mean for Brazil coffee supply? So let's go through that. And I want to put this into context. These numbers are from my friend Luis Aripi at Valor Cafe. I've actually stolen these figures because he's done the work so much better than I could ever possibly do it. So I've used these numbers, and what they show, I think the 21 crop year is it's been a bumper year for the Brazil farmer in terms of the amount of production and also the price they've received. Good prices, bumper production. You know, a lot due to the devaluation of the real. Well, and the prices have been at record levels in local currency terms at the moment and in the past, breaking records all the time. What this means is that the farmers have very strong hands. They don't need to sell coffee if it doesn't meet their price expectations. So looking at lower crop, they can hold and keep coffee as long as they like. The other point is that coffee is a dollar-denominated commodity, and that can become important if the pandemic problems, the economic problems continue. We've seen in the past people hold coffee because of the devaluation of the real or the upsurge in inflation. The other point I'd probably say is that, if anything, Luis's work probably underestimates the amount of revenue from coffee this year, because as we know, reading Newswise, there's been a huge amount of forward sales of the 21, 22 crop and the 22, 23 crop. And these have been more remunerative than spot sales, because basically you are able to take advantage of the carry-in on the New York market, and also the market expectations that the real will continue to devalue, so that the export is able to offer a premium price for forward crop delivery for the 21, 22 crop and for the 22, 23 crop. So when the price has gone up, a lot of the selling has been forward rather than on the spot market. Right. This is our numbers of availability for Robustas, and we can see the sharp upturn in the availability of Robustas in the 21-22 crop year. So we have the increase in production, 22-23 million bags, and kind of some carryover stock. But we have to be cautious what this means for exports, because we feel that, you know, as I said, 55% of this at the moment probably can go into the internal market. But we believe it can go even higher. What you have to remember is the Brazil market is overall is a price market. There has been some fantastic developments at the higher end and increasing quality in Brazil coffee, but still in Brazil, a lot of the coffee is given away free. I mean, it's incredible when you go into local garages or local restaurants, whatever, you're given coffee at the end of the meal and it's for free. And so obviously people just choose to a large extent the cheapest coffees. What we're going to have next year is the lower quality Arabicas that kind of that's been sorted out as we produce export quality coffee won't be there. So Conilons are more than likely, they're going to be the lowest price coffee there is. So we're going to see a switch into Conilons in the internal market. And that will impact the exports of Conilons. Right, and these are our numbers on Arabicas. I want to make 2 points on this. One is we feel, as we know, there was a drought in 2014-15, which lowered the crop. We feel a lot of the hidden stock in Brazil came out in that period because prices went very high at that time. And so this attracted, the supply in that year was not just current crop, there was a big rundown in supplies. So we don't think that hidden stock, if you like, is still there. So there is a much smaller stock in Brazil as we came into the 2021 crop year. Obviously, it's a record crop in 2021, and that has enabled farmers in Brazil to increase the stock levels. But we feel that this increase is not quite as big as many might think, because basically that crop is being used. We've seen the increase in exports and how that has been used for Brazil to dominate the market, but it also means that producer stock has been run down through the course of the year. And also we have to add in the use of Arabicas in the internal market as well. Also, I would like to point out, I think sometimes you look at 11 million bags of stocks going in a 21-22, start the 21-22 crop year and thinks that that's all usable. That's not true, because basically there is a minimum level of stock a country needs just to keep the mechanism of the coffee supply moving, you know, coffee and trucks, coffee moving to the ports. So you cannot run the stock down to zero. The other point is, and this year, as I've mentioned, with the amount of money the producer has, they might be very willing to hold back coffee if the prices are meeting their expectations. So lower stocks, the stocks are lower than you think, there's less usable stock than you think, and the usable stock might not be released at the price you want. So these are the final notes and questions. I kind of frame this to bring other people in the discussions. I've been lecturing here. So I've really put it as a number of questions rather than kind of statements. The first is, what coffee is going to replace Brazil? You can look at the numbers and you can argue over what the correct number is, but there's no doubt that there's going to be a fall in Brazil crop availability in the 21-22 crop year. So the question, what's going to replace that? One question I've asked before, what about the semi-washed? How are they going to be used? Will we see old crop semi-washed coffee being used to replace the Brazil shortfall? Then we have a big, for me, I think a big problem, and it's probably under publicized in the coffee world, and that is the actual level of 21, 22 and 22, 23 crop that's been sold forward. There's numbers, different numbers. I've heard, numbers of 28, 30%. We actually, of the 21, 22 crop has been sold forward. I think the numbers from Safras and Mercado, we actually think that's probably an underestimate. And it could be 35%, could be more. Now, the problem we have is that a lot of these coffees these sales were made when the crop was at 64. The spot price for coffee was 640, around 650 real a bag, and that looked a good price, and everyone was happy to sell forward, and it had worked in the previous year. Everyone was happy, the exporter gained and the farmer gained. This year it's different, because now these spot prices are beyond the wildest dreams of farmers. They've actually gone above 750 real a bag. So what looked like a good sale in the past now doesn't look so good. So, for instance, the fine cup coffee in the past in the forward markets is trading close to what lower quality coffee is now getting on the spot market. So how is that handled? This could have huge implications. I mean, instead of the farmer will obviously try to deliver, well, in a way, we'll try to work around the fact that the spot market price is bigger than the price of the crop was sold forward. And you can do that in a number of ways. One would be delivering lower quality coffee. The secondly is the straight default, which is an extreme thing, and you need the spot price to be a very good premium to the forward price, but it is possible. And if prices remain where they are, or if they go a touch higher in local currency terms, this is going to be a big dilemma as we go into the 21-22 crop year. And then how exposed is the market to Brazil margin risk? Because some of this coffee will have been hedged forward in New York and taken the short position. At the extreme, the exporter could be left in a position where he has no coffee and a short forward position. He has a short position in the New York market that he has to liquidate with the market going up. Again, how high does the price have to go for the market to release the last stock of a dollar-based commodity? The late pruning, how's that going to affect the 22-23 crop? Also, the less than ideal weather, which is at the start of the crop in October and November. How will that impact the young growth? We don't think you can come up with, as I said, with theoretical answers to this. This is something that will appear on the ground, and this is something where you need good field research. Again, it is possible, and it's theoretically possible, because you have a low crop this year, that could actually help the potential for on growth. It's only in May where you can look at how that on growth has developed. You can start answering these questions. Again, domestic consumption, how much of the Conalon crop will supply that? And how much can Conalon share go up? And then we have questions about the European roaster. Will they use higher amounts of Conalons in their blend, or will they stick with, will the glyphosate problems and the cup changing problems, because it's usually their blends are based on Vietnamese coffee, will this be a holdback? And then the question, with record local currency prices, will we in 2 or 3 years' time see a huge expansion in the Brazil coffee area? This is very possible. And then if that expansion takes place, will that lead to a big semi-washed increase in semi-washed production and a supercharged return of the semi-washed coffee in the certified stocks, which will change the nature of the New York Arabica contract forever? So there's questions. They're the key questions, and we flatter ourselves at pricing, actually, that Jack knows the answer to these problems. But we feel we have the knowledge and experience to help in this debate and provide independent insights into the answers. So there's going to be upcoming Brazil crop tours in May and as at the harvest. And I think these will be key tools in solving some of the problems and dilemmas about the 21-22 crop and even the 22-23 crop. And that's our disclaimer. That's all I've got for you. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Neil. This was genuinely fantastic. I'm sure that that everyone that participated genuinely enjoyed the forum and the content.
Well,
I do have I have just one question from my side. When you went out into the field in March, what was the most surprising finding to you that actually drove you to call a Arabica crop below 30 million?
I think there were a number of things. I mean, there's a whole list of surprises. And I think that's what field research does, because you have theoretical knowledge, you look at the climate, but that can't answer a specific question. And the field research is always surprises you. I think the fun is the extent of the pruning, the extent to which there are very, very few high yield farms this year. And across the area, I think you looked at the Sulaminas and you saw the climate problem, but really you weren't quite expecting that in Cerrado, because, you know, the farms are much more irrigated there. So it was a surprise to see the Cerrado so poor. And also the Zona de Mata, which, you know, after the record crop and the huge downswing. So a whole host of things I think you always get in field research. But also, one other thing I would say on the positive side was the huge impact of the new varieties in Conilons. The yields they are getting are absolutely super yields, beyond belief. And I think we've all seen the photos of these yields. But to see these types of farms is, you know, a real incredible thing.
Thank you very much, Neil. And then also when we look at 22-23 and to what extent has today's context potentially compromised the 22-23 crop, when we drill further down into semi-washed.
Yeah, the semi-washed, as I said, I mean, I think we put it in the final thing. On the semi-washed, well, the reduction in production itself is a big reason you're not going to get too much semi-washed. But there's, as I said, I thought I brought up two other things. One is that you don't need to produce so much semi-washed if your drying terraces aren't full. It costs money to do that. And if you're a smaller crop, there's less pressure to actually semi-wash the coffee. But also the non-homogeneity, I think, will impact it. Yeah, so what was the other thing, sorry? You asked something else?
Yeah, it was just the magnitude of the 22-23 crop impact.
Sorry. So, yeah, no, I think, as I said, I think you can't give definitive answers. And you look at the theory and you know that there was a delay to the start of the branch growth, for sure. And also, as I said, the rainfall, you know, it recovered in January, but it's been irregular. So again, that can impact the branch growth. So it's possible that it has been impacted, but you have to go to see in May what the capacity is. But then again, if you get a very good flowering in September, that can compensate for that somewhat. So it's an open question, but what I think is clear that a bumper 22-23 crop is definitely not guaranteed at the moment.
Okay, very good. Thank you so much, Neil. Again, really, really appreciate you sharing your time and your knowledge. We are getting to the end of the webinar. So I also want to thank all the audiences that took the time and dialed in. And I wish everyone a fantastic day ahead. Thank you again, Neil and Jack.
Okay, thank you for inviting me. Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.